All right, everyone, good morning. Hope you guys are doing well. We have about 2 minutes till class time, but thanks again for your attendance. And yeah, just hang in there. We'll be getting going in a few minutes. Morning, Naaman. How's it going? Hey, Selene. Hi there, Devin, Cameron, Sheely, Leah, Brandon. Appreciate all you guys being here. Hi, Sophia, Mia, Melanie. Morning, everyone. Hey there, Leo and Alexis. Welcome back. Hi, Justin, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so let me ask about your question, buffering. It's more or less 10, so I'm going to just get us started. But yeah, like about that, how is the quality? I know there's one thing that could cause it to be a little compromised, but it won't affect our lecture. But I am going to ask, how does the screen look? Is it blurry? Is the audio clear? Let me know about audio and then also know about video. Give me your report. How's the video? How's the audio? Like if I write, can you read that? Is it blurry? I'm just asking because if it's too blurry with the current internet situation, the audio is clear, that's good. And you say the video looks pretty good. Okay. Yeah, so then in that case, I think we're all right. Let me know, anybody, if the video quality dips too much. Focus is a little blurry. Okay, let me ask this. The quality of the video, is it different from how it normally looks for you? A little bit of a blurry screen? You can read hello, but not the thing below. Okay, guys, not to worry. Let me explain, though. This morning, there's like some kind of physical Wi-Fi router outage in my area. So I'm working off of the hotspot today. Because of that, bandwidth and stuff is a little bit less extensive, but not to worry. If the audio is clear, then what notes I have to give to you, I'm going to type them in the chat, okay? And that way you'll still get the exact notes that you need, but I won't be using the board just for this one meeting because of my internet issues in my local area. Hi, Peachy. Peachy says hello. Okay, good. Just a little troubleshooting, guys. It's actually, I think, on my end this time, but not to worry. We're all here together. You can hear my audio clearly, and I'm going to put the notes in the chat. So there's no need to worry about losing notes or any kind of content. But anyway, let's get started again. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's Thursday, the 11th. Basically, we're going to try and get through another good chunk of our notes on the philosophy of religion today. And you, of course, have a holiday on Monday. That doesn't affect our class because we have a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, but it'll be nice, I guess, for all of us to get a little more extra time to rest and recharge over the weekend. So, all right, guys, let's just jump back into what we were doing. When I left you guys last time, we were working through the notes on Ernest Nagel's article, Does God Exist? And so to kind of bring us back into context, Ernest Nagel is an atheist, so he doesn't believe in God. And that means, yeah, he finds fault with all the different arguments that make a case that God has to exist, that try to prove it. Oh, by the way, I don't want to forget, if anyone didn't have a chance to say hello in the chat, please do that. That's my little informal attendance record. And so as usual, make sure you get accounted for that. Yeah, so back to Nagel. Ernest Nagel says that there's problems with all these different arguments for God's existence. So I'll just briefly summarize the points of critique that he had for the ones that we already discussed, and then we'll add some new notes from there and discuss it from there. And to anybody coming in, just know that I was already explaining to the students before, we have a little less video clarity today because of a router issue in my area. So I'm going to type the notes into the chat today. All right. First of all, the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument by now hopefully is familiar. It's the one that says that everything has a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Anything that exists has to have some kind of cause that started it, that caused it to be. And the universe exists. So what the cause of the universe is has to be something. And it can't just be an infinity of causes that goes back and back forever. So there must be a first cause. And whatever the first cause is, must be something that does not depend on anything else. Of course, if it did depend on something else, then it couldn't have been the first thing. So that means the first cause is a necessary being that's not contingent. And this is the only way for there to be an explanation for the existence of the universe that does not involve an infinite regress. So there's got to be a necessary being, and that's God. Okay, and then after that, well, he gives his criticism. So Ernest Nagel said, first of all, why is it true that everything has to have a cause? He's not so convinced that that has to be the case. But even if you say that everything has to have a cause, here's another problem. If everything has to have a cause, then why doesn't God have to have one? Surely that could be inconsistent to say everything must have a cause, the universe has to have a cause, but God does not have to have one. Okay, his next point is that supposing that God doesn't have to have a cause, right, that he could be a necessary being that is kind of just self-sufficient, if God could be uncaused, then why not merely suppose that it is the universe itself which is the necessary being that lacks any cause and which is just self-sufficient? If so, at least we know the universe exists, so there'd be less, I guess, controversy in assuming that that's the necessary being. And then his last point of criticism was that he is not convinced that an infinite regress is really impossible. Isn't it perhaps possible for there to be an actual infinity of causes that never ever has an initiation? When we think about mathematics and geometry, we have a working understanding of actual infinity. Consider the number line or the geometric line and all of its points. So how come the timeline of history can't be infinitely dense just as much as those? Then was his criticism of the ontological argument. His criticism there is much similar to the critique of G.E. Moore. The ontological argument, again, is the one which says God is defined by all people as the greatest conceivable being. And since he is defined as the greatest conceivable being, he has to exist in the reality and the mind, because that's greater than just the mind. But Ernest Nagel says, well, that treats existence as though it's an attribute. It treats it as though it's a bill. He said, imagine that you know the definition of a $100 bill banknote. Whether you have such a thing in your wallet or not is totally unrelated to the definition. So if I acquire a $100 bill now, then I spend it and give it away to somebody, the definition of $100 bill doesn't change through the process of me either having it or not having it. So when one thing exists or doesn't exist, it's completely separate from what its defining traits are. I offered you a little alternative example, which was the case of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs don't exist today. They used to exist back then. According to like Jurassic Park, I guess it's theoretically possible to regenerate them again in the future. But whether they exist, don't exist, go extinct, come back, the definition of what a dinosaur is remains the same throughout all the changes. So existence is not a part of the definition. Okay, another point. Then there was his criticism of the design argument, and I think this is where we really left off at the end last time. So a little bit brief review of it. The design argument says that everything which has complexity and function has to have an intelligent creator. Think of a watch. A watch, there's no way it could just happen without an intelligent being that crafted it, because a watch has to have assembly of parts, and the parts can't be assembled in a random way. They have to be put together by a being that has the intelligence to know how they could possibly be combined so that they could perform the function of telling time. So watches have to be created by things that have intelligence because they're too functional and too complex. From there, he says, doesn't it seem obvious then that the works of nature, which also exhibit complexity and show a purpose, like in the case of the eye or whatever you like to mention. If those things have complexity and a purpose and function, then shouldn't we say they must have an intelligent creator as well? But in this case, it's God. Okay, now his criticism of that was twofold. First of all, he says the real assurance that we have that the watch has a maker is because we make watches, not so much because it has a function, just because of the obvious fact that we are those who make watches ourselves, so we know that they have a creator. And then when we switch the example to the case of the eye, because the whole argument's based on this analogy between the watch and the eye, well, in the case of the eye, yeah, it has a function, but that can be explained without assuming the existence of any kind of intelligent creator, because we have the theory of evolution. And so according to that theory, we should expect for there to be such things as eyes, ears, functional adaptations to the organism's environment over a long span of time, just due to natural selection. So he says if we have a better explanation for the purpose and function seen within nature than the idea of a creator, and if the things in man-made creation that we're comparing it with are only known to have a creator for the fact that we made them, then the analogy seems to fall apart and it's no longer effective at making the case that there has to be a God. Okay, so that's just a little bit of summary to get us started. From here, I'm going to take you through some of the last remaining notes in Nagel's paper. So he launches into that criticism that I just reviewed of the big three arguments that we've now studied together, the ontological, the cosmological, and the design argument. But there are a couple of additional arguments that he also briefly references at the tail end of his paper. And these are, I think, arguments for God's existence that have achieved little less prominence, so they're maybe not the same level of fame and notoriety as the other three, but there's still something to say about them, and he wants to also try to show his criticisms of them. So two more quick little, let's call these, I'm going to put in the chat, miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. So these are like kind of in the miscellaneous grab bag of extra arguments that some people give, and he wants to show what they are and also criticize them. Okay, so one of those arguments, and I'll just label it with number one, is, let me call it the argument from unfairness. Okay, so I'm just putting the notes in the chat today, as I was saying earlier. It's an exception to our normal method only because there's some buffering and internet bandwidth issues that were making the screen blurry, so this makes sure that you can read it clearly. Miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. So the first one described is the argument from unfairness. And here, let me just put the basic gist of the argument now below. So here's what it really says. If God did not exist, okay, see, it's a simple statement right there. It says, if God did not exist, then the world would be just too unfair, and therefore there must be a God. Let me explain the basis of this, this simple argument. Okay, so let me get into it with you guys through questions that you can help me answer. Here's a question then. Do bad things ever happen to good people? What do you think about that? I mean, in a way, this is a self-evident answer, but I'd like to see if you can process that. Do bad things ever happen to good people? Good people who've done nothing wrong and don't deserve any kind of bad things, but still something really terrible happened to them. Sure, that can happen, and it's sad, but it happens all the time, okay? People that have done nothing particularly wrong sometimes do suffer some of the worst tragic losses and harms. And, you know, it's a little bit disturbing to go through some of the examples, but you know what I'm talking about. People, little children sometimes get slaughtered at the kindergarten by a school shooter, people getting raped, tortured, thrown in prison for things they didn't do, shot in the street. So obviously, you know, look at COVID, right? People, good people losing their lives, having done nothing wrong, you know, dying alone without their family around. This is a dark picture, but just talking about some facts. So clearly bad things can happen to good people. We hope it doesn't happen too much, but it's certainly possible and does happen. So another question, can good things ever happen to bad people? Can people, you know, that have done some of the worst things ever enjoy their life and enjoy the best things that life has to offer without ever having any kind of accountability or penalty? Can that happen? That's another question. So you told me that bad things can happen to good people. Can good things happen to bad people too? Let me see what you think. Yeah, for sure. Okay, and that's another obvious fact. Sometimes people that do bad things are punished and they face the accountability they deserve. But in other cases, you know, people can get away with it, or they can even enjoy getting away with it, right? I mean, there's some horrible individuals out in the world. People that are serial killers, rapists, you know, and if a person's a serial killer and they killed a bunch of people, never got caught, and then just went to their grave, then you could argue, yeah, they never really did face any kind of punishment or penalty for the things that they did. Okay, Brandon, you also say many events are independent of each other, exclusionary. Yes, but I mean, I'm just saying it's a general point, right? Like, we've all seen bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. So coming back to the larger issue here, the argument that we've talked about above, the argument says that if God did not exist, then this world would be too unfair. Why? Because to those good people who suffered and went through the worst things that you can imagine, well, if there's a God, he could balance the scales of justice by doing what for this person? Let's say the person who goes to their grave having suffered the worst things, but they were a good moral human being that didn't do anything wrong. If there's God, he could show, well, he could do what for this person to right the wrongs that occurred within their life, the unjustified suffering that they went through. If there's God, he can make the situation fair by doing what for that person? Let me hear what you think. So I'm going into the case, like, you know, say that it was a good person that suffered. Okay, so yeah, going to heaven. In the afterlife, we think of God as the divine judge who balances the scales of justice, right? So he dispenses penalty and reward for the deeds that you had in life. So in case God exists, it's like, don't worry, the fact that this person suffered so much, who was a good person, they're going to get their heavenly reward. And so that's okay. And again, if there's a God, then what about those people that did the worst possible things and never suffered and actually enjoyed every moment of it? If there's a God, then I guess you guys understand that he could also dispense punishment out to that person in the afterlife by denying them of heaven or even sending them to hell. So if there were a God, then he could make it fair that sometimes people suffer in life who've been good, and he can make it fair that sometimes people prosper in life who've been bad. But if there's no God, okay, and this is what the argument is saying, then those bad people who never faced any justice would just never have a penalty. They would just go to their grave and that would be it. And on the other hand, the good people that suffered and were put through the worst experiences, if there's no God, then they don't get any reward. That's it. They just suffered, and they were good people who suffered. So the argument says, well, that just can't be the case. The world can't be that unfair. So there has to be a God, because otherwise this world is just a hopelessly unfair place to live in, where bad things happen to good people sometimes and good things happen to bad people, and nothing ever is done to balance these scales of injustice afterwards. So that's the argument, okay? And keep in mind, Nagel is just presenting it to knock it down because he's an atheist, so he's not going to find this to be a good argument. Before I continue, let me see your comment, Brandon. You've always wondered in all of history, many people did very bad things in the name of religion and believe they did good. So ultimately, isn't good and bad subjective to the individual? Well, I mean, Brandon, if it is subjective, then let's use your moral compass. According to Brandon, do people who have done good things ever suffer? And that's all I'm asking. I mean, I'm not asking for you to defer to someone else's judgment of what you think good and bad is. It's just a common sense point, right? Like, if a little kid gets shot in school, they didn't deserve that. They didn't do anything for that to be justified. So I don't want it to be like too overly complicated, right? Like, you're thinking, well, if I'm a martyr or something for like a religious cause, I believe that I'm doing something righteous. And so isn't this a gray area case? Is this like the example Professor Vulich is talking about? I can sort of see how that's complex because the person thinks they're doing the right thing, but I don't. Well, we're just talking about what you think then, Brandon. Like, if someone did something bad in just an ordinary common sense way of looking at it, don't they sometimes still benefit or not necessarily suffer? And if someone does something good in an uncomplicated sense to be defined by you, if they live, so yeah, back to the argument one last time, okay? The argument says that if there's no God, there's no punishment for the evildoers, there's no reward for the people who are good. So if they don't get their just desserts in life, then the unfairness just remains. And that can't be the case, so there has to be a God. But now, I'm asking you to think about the criticism of this, okay? Get in the headspace of like an Ernest Nagel type. What do you think would be said on the other side to dispute this claim or this argument? Like, for example, can anyone think of a reason why this might not actually prove the existence of God, convinced that God exists based on these premises? What do you think would be the main way of trying to push back on this conclusion or hear from anybody here? What's the problem with this argument? It says there's got to be God, otherwise the world's too unfair. Well, Kobe, you're saying the belief of karma. But that does not really help, because karma itself is like a divine force of justice. People, again, the question here is whether God is proven to exist by means of the... I don't understand, though, how your comment relates to what I've said, because you're asking a question, but I need an assertion, since I've asked, what is the reason, if any, that this does not prove that God exists? Maybe if you expanded on your question a little, I would understand it better. But anyways, the question is supernatural, like karma or God or the devil, okay? Because like I was surprised to hear that you said it doesn't prove God exists, and then you start mentioning other religious concepts like karma and the devil and stuff. This is an atheist who disputes this argument. Okay, so Janice, even if God didn't exist, wouldn't people still suffer because of their personal morals or lack of? Well, some of them would, but not all of them. You know, like there are some people who just love killing people, and they enjoy doing it. Otherwise, you know, what would their motivation be? So some people might have guilt because they did bad things, and that would be like their kind of self-imposed punishment. But that doesn't generally happen in every single case. And that also doesn't explain the other side where like a little child was murdered. Their harm and loss is the other side of the equation. Like they've suffered and they didn't deserve it. But you're asking questions again. Someone give me a statement. State for me why this does not prove the existence of God, according to a critic like Ernest Nagel. Or are you convinced? You're like, yeah, that's a proof that God exists. The world can't be that unfair, so the argument is correct. There has to be a God, and this has convinced me even more that there has to be a God. Tell me, though, why it doesn't convince that there has to be a God. I would think it's kind of clear. It's very obvious why it doesn't convince or persuade that prove that there's a God. It just says, if there's a God, then the world's fair. If there's no God, the world's unfair. Now tell me, if you can, why you think that does or does not prove that God exists? Okay, Kobe. Normal circumstance. People just find themselves in bad situations and there just isn't an explanation for them being in those terrible places. Okay, Celine, say the world is unfair. Brandon, I mean, the world can be unequal. There's no reason why it can't be unfair. Okay, good. That's what I'm looking for. So this is the basic kind of critique of this argument. The argument is entirely based around the assumption that the universe, the world, has to be fair. Since it has to be fair, and the only way that it could be is if there's a God to punish people that are bad and reward people that are good. If that's the only way that it can be fair, there has to be a God. That's what the argument is saying. But you, the critic, or whoever the critic, can step forward and say, but hold on, who says that things are fair? Who said the world is fair? If we deny that assumption, then the argument falls apart, because it says God being there is the only guarantee that this world is fair. So there must be a God. But if you don't even believe necessarily that the world is fair, or like who says it's fair, then the argument would not have any force, because you would deny it right at the beginning and say, stop right there, it's not a fair world. So the guarantee of God making it fair doesn't apply. It's kind of like, you guys, a lot of you have grown up and heard these, I don't know what this is. Is this wise words? I feel like it's cynicism, but parents and sometimes people, when they're trying to give you hard lessons in life, they say this, hey, life's not fair. Like as if they're trying to make you a realist, you know, get used to it. If you think everything's going to work out and be fair, you're going to be disappointed. So just come like with a clear understanding from your early days. Life's not fair. Just I don't like it when people say that to kids, because it's like, what are you telling them? Just don't even expect it to be fair, or don't even try to make it better. But anyway, people do say that. So I think the truism that people hold is that it's not necessarily fair. And this argument is predicated on the assumption that it has to be, and God's the only way that it could be. So I feel that that's really the problem in the argument. And here's what the author says along the same lines. He says, so first he describes the argument itself. Says, so he attributes the argument to Immanuel Kant, another author that we'll discuss in a few weeks, and the fact that evil men frequently enjoy the best things the world has to offer. So what can guarantee that this is possible? Such a guarantee can only be found in God, who must exist if the highest good is not to be a mere ideal. The existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God is thus postulated as a necessary condition for the possibility of a moral life. And he says, despite the prestige the argument has acquired, it's difficult to grant it any force. It's easy enough to assume God's existence, but as Bertrand Russell observed in another connection, assumption has all the advantages of theft over honest work. No assumption carries with it any assurance that what is assumed is actually the case. And although we may assume God's existence as a means of guaranteeing the possibility of happiness together with virtue, the assumption does not establish the actual possibility of this ideal, nor the fact of God's existence. So there you see the critique. And yeah, Jerry, the buffering and stuff, here's a question. Can you hear me? Is the question. Are you able to hear my words that I'm speaking? Or is the audio having a problem for you? Jerry, you mentioned the video. Let me hear you a quick reply. The audio cuts out every now and then. Mark's saying it's fine. Well, as long as this lecture is coherent for you, then it should be fine. And when you watch the playback later, the audio will play through as normal. So we're just going to work through whatever little technical issues that sometimes arise. Today, there was a router outage in my local area, so I couldn't use Wi-Fi. I have to use the hotspot, mobile hotspot. And that cuts down a little bit of the bandwidth of the stream. But not to worry, guys. Just follow the notes that you see here in the written chat and do your best to try and connect it to my words, and you can watch the replay later as well. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next of these miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. So I told you about one, the argument from unfairness. Here's number two, and it's known as argument from religious experience. Thank you. If anybody came in a few minutes later, I was explaining this at the top of class, that today, just this one meeting, there could be like a slight buffering and clarity issue, but I'm trying my best to work around it by giving you the notes in the chat and speaking clearly, okay? So now we're talking about this next miscellaneous argument for God's existence, argument from religious experience. Okay, so let me just give you a breakdown of this. Sometimes people who believe in God give this kind of reasoning. They say, the reason I believe in God is because I had a religious experience myself. Okay, now let me ask you guys, if you can, what do you think is the idea of a religious experience? Like, what does this concept refer to? Sometimes they're called mystical experiences. I kind of prefer the label religious experience because mystical sometimes draws associations from like Eastern religions or practices. But either way, what is a religious experience? Janice, you say a miracle. Okay, that's one example that's possible, right? All right, so I can maybe add some full context. A religious experience is a time where a person has an experience and they think this somehow shows that God exists, right? Like, and this can take a number of different forms. One could be someone thought something miraculous happened that they witnessed. Another could be like you prayed, right, Jerry, and you noticed the fulfillment of the prayer. So you felt like this shows the reality of God. Another case could be, I mean, just a transcendent moment. You know, you're like praying, meditating or something, and then you felt like the presence of God just manifested itself to you and made itself apparent to you. In another case, it might be triggered by like a near brush with death. And from that experience, somehow the presence of God became forcefully vivid to you, and that now you use as your evidence that God existed. So religious experiences can take all these different forms, but they're basically what they have in common is that based on that powerful, connection or experience, someone says, it showed me that God exists. It revealed that God exists to me. Of argument. And if you imagine encountering somebody who bases their belief on this kind of experience. You would say to them, do you believe in God? They would say yes. And then you could say, well, why? What is the reason? And if this is their main reason, they would say, well, because I had an experience. And it's hard to explain, but when I had that experience, fill in the details, I realized that God existed. It just became totally obvious to me. So that's another way to get to, that's another basis that some rely on. But now, keep in mind, we're talking to the Ernest Nagels of the world, and so he does not agree with this argument. He doesn't think it proves God exists. So let's now try to get into that. Why do you think that someone might argue this doesn't really make proof that God exists, even if one had a religious experience? How is it that it's not necessarily going to convince the skeptic? Okay, that's the right way to look at it. How come this argument might not necessarily persuade a skeptic, a non-believer, that God exists? What would the non-believer perhaps say in rebuttal, or what could they think as a way of rejecting the conclusion? Okay, so Naaman, you say luck. But when you say luck, though, Naaman, it's not always that it was an event, right? It's not like, oh, I almost died and God saved me, but really it was luck. I mean, I understand what you mean, but it could just be someone was meditating, right? Like sitting, on the top of a mountain meditating. They're like, wow, God is real. I can feel his presence. That doesn't involve luck at all. So, but I like the point you made. Kobe, you're saying lack of proof. And I forget the actual name associated here, Jim, but you say delusion. Yes, another possibility. Brandon, just because you can't explain something doesn't mean a higher being was responsible. Also a fair point. Janice, you're saying there's no evidence, or it could be a coincidence, or the evidence is anecdotal. These are all great points, okay? So let me kind of try and bring them together and say something concise. One problem with the argument from religious experience is that the evidence that is given is based on a person's prior personal experience. And that type of evidence cannot be shared with other people. Janice, you said there's no evidence. I think it's more like the evidence cannot be made available to someone else, right? And that's not the kind of evidence that other people can rely on, right? Like, so if I said to you, hey, Jones is the killer of Smith, and you say to me, what's the evidence? I say, well, look, here, take a look at this footprint that we found at the crime scene, and you can see that it matches a shoe that Jones is known to own. That's evidence for you. Now, the other party can look at that footprint, and they can consider how it matches the identity of the suggested culprit. But in this case, there's nothing you can show another person. All you can do is report to them, convey, hey, I had a religious experience. You can't say to them, do you want to see it? Look at it yourself. And in that case, you'll see the evidence and come to the same conclusion. So it's evidence of a kind, but it's private to the person who experienced it. It's locked away forever in their memory and in their own psychology. So it can't be publicly investigated or verified by other people. And the other thing is this, and this is kind of what some of you, I think, have also suggested. The other problem with the argument is, for whatever the religious experience it claims, there's always going to be some non-supernatural alternative explanation for it, right? Like, so you could say, you think you had a religious experience of God, but what was really happening is you were on drugs, or you were sleep deprived, or you were in an emotionally heightened state of suggestibility. You're going through a psychotic episode. You were half asleep. So all of you're dehydrated or something. So all of these other things could be offered as the non-supernatural explanation for the same psychological experiences. So since the evidence can't be shared, and since there are alternative explanations that don't imply the existence of the supernatural, the argument therefore lacks the power to persuade the skeptic. And let's keep focus on what arguments are for. Arguments are given to convince people of a conclusion. So you wouldn't give an argument to someone who already agreed with your point of view, right? If it's two theists talking to each other, like if you say to the other person, hey, I believe in God because I had a religious experience, and you're talking to both believe in God, but there'd be no point to making the argument there. You make an argument to convince someone who's not already convinced. And so to who doesn't already possess these religious experiences, it's not like you can give it to the person. And they're always going to hold on to the idea that it's explained in some other type of way. So that's why he thinks it's an ineffective argument. It's not persuasive to those that have not had such experiences, and there's always this other way to explain the claimed experience. Okay, now one more thing from the Ernest Nagel article. Okay, now we've gone through all of his criticisms of different arguments that God exists. But at the very end of his essay, he presents an argument that God does not exist. And that's something we haven't looked at yet. We've looked so far at arguments that try to prove the existence of God paired together with criticisms of them. But we have not yet seen anybody make the argument directly that there is no God. And so this is an argument that God doesn't exist. It's actually a quite classic argument that goes back at least 1,000 years, and it's called the problem of evil. So I'm going to just title it here. Okay, the problem of evil. So in philosophy and in logic, when an argument is written, we write it out in what we call standard form, meaning that you have the premises listed and then the conclusion at the bottom. The conclusion of the argument is the claim that you're trying to prove to be true, and the premises of the argument are the evidence that's supposed to support that conclusion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type here in the chat the problem of evil argument. It's got two premises that lead to the conclusion. And so hang on while I write them down. I'm going to number the premises number 1 and number 2. So the first premise says that if God exists, then there would be no evil in the world. Okay, that's the first premise. Now here's the second one. I'm writing just below. But there is evil in the world. Okay, so the conclusion, I'm just going to write C so that you know it's the conclusion. Therefore, God does not exist, according to the argument. Okay, so you see there our argument that we're now considering, the problem of evil. This is an argument given by atheists, skeptics, non-believers to try and establish the non-existence of God. So let's think about it and go through each premise step by step. The first one says that if God did exist, then there would not be any evil in the world. Before we move on to the rest of the argument, let's just think about this first premise. Why do you think that someone would say this? Or what is it about God that would lead somebody to... No, Alessandra, let me be very clear. This is an argument that God does not exist. This is an argument to the contrary that shows there's no God. So we're done with his miscellaneous arguments. That was just the argument from Unfairness and the argument from religious experience. After I finished those, I said, okay, and we haven't yet looked at an argument that God does not exist. So now we're sort of switching gears to this. Does this make sense, Alessandra? Yeah? So it's not an argument for God's existence. It's an argument for no, God doesn't exist. So it's definitely against God. It's not for God. Does that help? It's the only argument that we're looking at all. Well, maybe a few others are kind of in the ballpark, but it's the only one that tries to directly prove there's no God. Okay. Yeah, so Ivan, God wouldn't allow his subjects to suffer. Mark, because God is powerful enough to make all the evil things go away. Those two comments are very good, and that is the argument. So the argument is saying that if God exists, he's presumed to be omnipotent and omnibenevolent. So omnipotent, you guys understand, means having all power, unlimited power to do anything. Omnibenevolence means supremely good, divinely good and righteous and just. So putting those two things together, you would think that a being that is all perfectly good would not want there to be evil, because evil is contrary to good. And a being that's all powerful would be able to do something about it, would be able to just stop it at any moment through his will. So if there was a God, some argue that he would not allow for there to be evil because he wouldn't want there to be, and he would have the power to stop it. But now the second premise, continues by saying, but there is evil in the world. And that, we've kind of already talked about it a little bit in the previous part of today's meeting, meaning just that there are bad things that happen all the time. People getting hurt, killed, tortured, even just natural disasters, like a tsunami wave swallows up a whole community or whatever, you fill in the blank. There's all kinds of horrifying things that happen. So the conclusion of the argument is God doesn't exist. I guess I didn't even mention some war, famine, the Holocaust. I mean, so a lot of bad things happen in the world. The argument says if there was a God, that stuff wouldn't happen. He would not let it happen. But it does. So we must be in a universe where there isn't such a God. That's the conclusion of the argument. Now, every time there's an argument, there's always objections and criticisms that come back. Does anybody think they might know what one could say to object to this argument? Is there any reason to think this argument is got problems? If so, what could they be? Because there are some such problems, and I want to be fair always to all sides. So does anyone detect any kind of issues with this argument where you might say, I don't think that really shows there's no God? What would you say back to someone who made this argument to you? They say, look at all the evil in the world. You really think there's God? How could there be? If he existed, he wouldn't let that happen. So I'm telling you there's no God. Okay, so Leo, you say, why does God's existence eliminate evil? Well, Leo, because, I mean, all-powerful and all good. What would you do if you had all the power in the world? Would you let people keep just getting shot in the street that are, like, innocent? Okay, Kobe, you're saying it's God's punishment for people's sins. But why are they sinning, though? I mean, he's got the power over everything, so isn't it just they're sinning because it's part of his divine plan or whatever? It's not like it's something he couldn't expect them to do. Brandon, don't people justify it saying God is trying to teach you a lesson or make you grow as a person? Yeah, that's another point. And by the way, I'm just playing devil's advocate. When I push back against the things you're saying, I'm just trying to make you think twice. Like, is there something that one would say back? But yeah, about justifying the existence of evil and stuff, that's definitely one of the main kind of critiques, and that we have free will. Also, Celine, religiously, people would believe their faith was being tested. Okay, also that's a good point. So let me kind of speak on those points. And you're right. The main way of rejecting the argument is to say that what you think of as evil is all actually part of God's plan, and it's all for the best. Maybe it doesn't seem like it's for the best when you're going through it, but God allows for the existence of what we think of as evil just because it gives us something to move beyond, to strive to overcome. It gives us challenges to face, and so on. But I've always thought, right, that it doesn't necessarily make sense to me to say that we couldn't value goodness or that we couldn't be good people if we just chose not to do evil things and that wasn't something that we wanted to do. Kobe, to your point about free will, and some others have said the same, I know what you're thinking. Okay, so God allows and grants free will to people, and the evil that happens is due to the choices people make of their own free will to do bad things. One thing about that doesn't really help with the case of like natural disasters that just come down on people and just destroy their lives, because there's no free will involved in a person's choice on that. But setting that aside, what about free will? What is it about free will that you think means people have to do bad things? I mean, wouldn't we still have free will if we could contemplate doing those bad things and just chose not to? I mean, like me, for example, I'm not going to kill anybody. I have free will, but I'm not going to use it to kill a person. It's not like I'm not free just because I'm not going to do that. So couldn't we have all been those type of people who have the power, I guess, theoretically, to do bad things, but we're just not motivated to do them because we know that they are bad? I mean, even take the story of Genesis from the Old Testament Bible, right? Didn't it seem like God's plan initially was to allow man to live in paradise forever? So why couldn't he have just allowed for the Garden of Eden to persist instead of tempting Eve with the serpent? Doesn't that allow for the possibility of the fall from grace, which otherwise might not have had to happen? From a religious standpoint, Kobe, you say because of the original sin, there is temptation. But even in the original sin, why did he tempt Eve with the serpent? This is a choice that he made. Couldn't he have just allowed them to persist in the Garden of Eden, in paradise forever? I mean, so the fall of man is supposed to be the fault of, I guess, Eve for biting the apple from the tree of knowledge. But it was placed there by God, and it was allowed to happen by God. So was it really true that we could have done otherwise? Wasn't this all part of God's plan from the beginning? Anyway, I'm just spinning the wheels a little bit and making you think about it. Yeah, the Genesis story tries to give an account of the existence of free will that allowed for the fall of man from the Garden of Eden. Now the woman has to give birth in labor, and man has to work by the sweat of his brow. And these are like what the scriptures say. But to a philosophical analysis, it doesn't settle all of the deep and perplexing questions. Why did God want to tempt man? Why did God want to allow even for the conditions where it could have been possible to fall from grace? Anyways, just food for thought. In the end, these are fair criticisms and pushback, but what Nagel says is that even if it's just apparent evil, even if evil is like an illusion, and if you could see it from God's perspective, you'd see that everything's for the best. Even apparent evil isn't ideal, and it's kind of cold comfort for a person who's going through something like that to tell them, don't worry, God has a plan and this is all for the best. I mean, if you poke your head into like a torture chamber and say, it's going to be all right because God knows what he's doing and this is all for the best. So he thinks that there's still something wrong, even with the apparent evil, if that's what we call it, that we experience and that we see in life. Yeah, but Kobe, I mean, I really mean this thing that I'm saying. Couldn't we just watch a bunch of movies where people are getting killed and horrible things are happening? And when we watch them, we're like, man, we're free to do that. But wow, we never would, because that is just so wrong and messed up. I don't see why that's not free will. So everyone that talks about free will in these conversations about this argument makes it seem like free will means people literally have to do the bad things. But I've got free will right now, and I'm telling you, I'm never going to hurt anybody like that. So to me, it's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, fair point. So we can move on from Nagel then. We've finished our discussion of him. And now we go to the next author in the series. So the next person is this man named Blaise Pascal. This is a French philosopher of the 17th century. There's his name. Here are the dates of his life. He lived from 1623 until 1662. So a kind of short life, but he had a major impact. He was a mathematician, scientist, and a philosopher of religion. And he wrote a book which was only published after his death in 1669. So it's posthumously published, and it's called Pensées, which is a French word that means thoughts. So from his 1669 book, so Aaliyah, the past arguments, what I've just done is completely reviewed the writing of Nagel. Okay, so you have to read these articles too, Aaliyah and everybody else. But if you read the Nagel article, you'll see that he gives commentary on the cosmological, ontological, and design argument. Then he discusses the argument from unfairness, the argument from religious experience. Then he presents the problem of evil, and that's it. Now Nagel's done. That's the set of information from Nagel. Criticisms and objections to all the classical arguments, plus the two miscellaneous ones, plus the presentation of the problem of evil. And now we're done with Nagel for the moment, and we're moving to Blaise Pascal. So good question. Blaise Pascal, French philosopher of the 17th century. You see his lifespan there. And in 1669, his book Pensées came out, which means in English, thoughts. Now, in the book Pensées, he gives this argument that you ought to believe in God. So it's another, argument being made to try and establish the belief in God in the reader. And the argument has been called the wager, okay? And that's what it's called in our book, so I'm just putting it here, the wager. In fact, in the century since he wrote it, it's acquired such prominence that people often now call it Pascal's wager, just after him. But in his own book, being Pascal himself, he just calls it the wager. Okay, so Pascal has a way different approach than these other authors that have tried to make the case for God. Because if you know, the other authors have all tried to directly prove that God exists. And Pascal says right off at the beginning, I'm not going to try to make the proof that God exists, because he says it's not possible to prove that. He says, actually, no one can prove that God exists, and also no one can prove that he doesn't exist. The reason is because if he does exist, then he is an infinite being. And that means that he would be so far beyond the limited powers of the human mind to understand that we would never be able to form a coherent argument that can actually prove that he exists or that he doesn't. So Pascal says, I'm not even going to go there. I'm not going to try and prove that God exists, because it's not even possible to do that. He also says this, in a way, it makes sense when many people that believe in God refuse to give an argument, because it's almost like they recognize that that would be foolish to even attempt. And in a sense, it might even be disrespectful to the majesty of God to attempt a proof of a being that is so far beyond our human limitations. So he says, I'm not going to try to prove it or disprove it, because I don't think it's possible, and therefore it makes sense, and people shouldn't criticize the religious believer for not having such an argument. But he says this, even if we can't prove whether he exists or not, which one it is, we know this much has to be true, that although we cannot specifically prove that he does or that he does not, we know that he must either what or what. Do you think you can fill in that either or statement that I'm suggesting or hinting at? Even if we can't prove he exists or prove he doesn't exist, it has to be that he either what or what. It's got to be one or the other, that he either blank or blank. Even if we don't know which one it is, the either or overall is that what? Let's see in the chat. We don't know that he exists. We don't know that he doesn't exist. Neither can be proven. But definitively, it's either that he exists or doesn't. That's correct, Kobe. He either exists or does not exist. So this is a statement that he says everyone has to agree with because it covers all possibilities. God either exists or does not exist. So let me actually put a full statement here. None can prove whether God exists or not. But we know for sure that God either exists or does not exist. And there's just a note for you in the chat. It says, none can prove whether God exists or not, but we know for sure that God either does or does not exist. This is Pascal in his writing who says this. So that type of sentence, either or, it's what we call a disjunction in logic and in grammar. It's an either or sentence. Okay. So any statement that has that form is considered a disjunction. If I told you that I'm either going to go for a run today or lift weights, that would be a disjunction, which has the two disjuncts, either run or do weights. Now, of any disjunction which has the form a or not a, it's a logical necessity because one of those two things must be the case for any statement A. So like, take this. Either I was born in the 90s or I was not born in the 90s. It cannot be that I both was and wasn't. It has to be exactly one and it can't be both. Take the existence of aliens in outer space. I can't prove that they exist, and I also can't prove that they don't, but I know that they either exist or they don't exist. If they're out there, then that's the case. And if there's no such thing, then that's the case, but it can't be both. It can't be that they both do and also don't exist. So the same of God. That's what author Pascal is saying. Nobody can prove this one way or the other, but we know that it has to be exactly one of those two cases, that he either exists or doesn't. So he says the position we're in then is that we're kind of forced to wager on which of these two outcomes we think is the case. Are we going to choose to believe in God or not believe in God? In a way, he says it's somewhat comparable to a coin flip. Okay, now let me explain how this compares to a coin flip wager. When you flip a coin, you don't know until it lands which of the two sides it's going to be. It could be heads, it could be tails, but before the coin lands, there's no possible way to know. That's the reason that it's a random outcome, 50-50 pretty much. But you know that it has to be one or the other. So you don't know if it'll be heads or tails, but you know that it's going to be exactly one or the other. So now suppose that someone wants to make a bet with you, and they say, what is the coin, what side of the coin do you think will show up when I flip it? And you could pick heads, and you could get heads correct, or you could pick tails and get tails correct. You could also pick the face that doesn't show. So there's two ways to win and two ways to lose. He says that the question of whether to believe in God is kind of, in a way, parallel to this coin flip scenario. Because as with the coin flip, there's two choices. Pick this or pick that. Choose that you think he exists or choose that you don't. And you don't know which side it's going to be, and you can't know, but you got to choose one of the two sides. Now, I think, have to use the board a little bit for this part of the lecture. I'm going to try to draw it so big and so clear that maybe it'll show through in the video. Can you see that? Does it look like a big box with 4 squares within it? Let me know in the chat. I hope that much is easy to see. Now, this is what we're going to call this is called a Punnett Square. This kind of diagram is used in game theory to game out the possible outcomes from a choice situation, to show what the possible benefits and costs could be, depending on how you choose to act and the outcomes. So here in the top two, I'm going to show you a coin flip wager in this Punnett Square. So on the top left, in this vertical column, I'm going to label it with one of the 2 outcomes of the coin flip, and that is landing heads. So it says, this word here says lands heads. Okay. This one over here is just going to be the opposite face. So it says lands tails. Now, in these 2 left horizontal rows, we're going to place the 2 types of betting stance that you can take regarding the coin flip. So what is one choice that a bettor can make in the coin flip scenario? It's like you could pick this or you could pick that. Not too difficult, but let me hear you say it. A person, if they wanted, could choose, fill in the blank, what? Two choices in a coin flip. One of them is which choice? Okay, you could bet heads, you could pick heads. Pick heads, and then of course the other option, picking tails. Okay, now, each of the 4 boxes in the grid connects a betting stance with an outcome of the bet. And so, like, for example, this box stands for the case where a person picks heads and it did land heads, and so forth with the other 3 boxes. So let's go through the 4 cases here. There are 4 combinations of betting stance and outcome given a coin flip. And I just want you to tell me whether I should write W or L, depending on whether this would represent a win or a loss for the bettor. So in this top box, let's call this box 1. And in your notes, you can say that to keep it clear. Box 1, is it a win or a loss? Is this a W or an L? Again, when one picks heads and heads lands. Win or loss? What do you think on that? Is that a win? Is that a loss? A person picks heads and heads turned up. Should be simple. It's a win, yes, that's winning. Okay, box 2. This is box 2. Picking heads, landing tails. Box 2, anybody? Win or loss? This one's an L. That's a loss. That's picking heads, but it didn't turn out. It turned out to be the other side of the coin. Tails. That's a loss. Now here's another case. Person picks tails and heads lands. Box 3, win or loss? Let me know about the box 3 case. Okay, I assume you're talking about box 3. You could preface your comment with a number, but it's okay. I think we all clearly understand this is another loss. Okay, and then finally, last box, box 4. You pick tails, and it is tails. So this is definitely a win. So all you're looking at here is the matrix of possibilities concerning a coin flip bet. There are 2 ways the coin can land, and there's 2 ways you can bet. And if your pick matches the face that lands, you win either by picking heads when it is heads or picking tails when it's tails. And if your choice doesn't match the outcome, then you can lose in 2 ways, obviously. Now, this kind of choice situation, Pascal says, is very much similar to the choice you're facing as to whether you're going to believe in God or not. Okay, so now let me kind of redraw the graph and show you why he thinks that if you really think about it, it's just much safer and smarter for you to believe in God instead of choosing to not believe. Okay, so then Now we're looking at not a coin flip, but the big question of God's existence. So if you're going to wager on this question, let's go into the two choices you can make here in the left horizontal rows. What's one choice you can make on this wager of whether God exists or doesn't? One pick, one choice could be to choose to pick what? In this top row. So it's not about calling heads or tails. It's about either believing or not believing. Yeah, so one pick is believe God exists. Believe God exists. And of course, the contrary choice or option is a person to not believe that God exists. So now up here, this is the equivalent of like which case it ends up being. So what's one outcome of the question of God's existence? It could be that actually what? Or it could be that, on the other hand, since he says we don't really know, we can't prove it, one possibility is that, and tell me what you write right there. This isn't about what you choose to believe, this is about whether it's actually the case. So one possibility is that what? That God exists, and then the other is that he doesn't. Okay. Well, no, Angel, not about there is or isn't evidence. We're just talking about that he exists. God exists, that's one case. The other, God does not exist. The other possibility. Okay, now, we're going to do the same thing as did before, and just go through each of the four possible combinations of wager and outcome. So suppose that a person believes God exists, and in the end, that turns out to be true. God did exist. So would this be a win or a loss, considering the parameters of this diagram? Person believes, and then in fact, it is true. So is this a win or loss for that person? Relative to the wager analysis that we're looking at. It is a win. It's a win here. But question though, what does the person win? What's the payoff or the jackpot, as it were? What is won? It's a win. We're clear on that. That's good. But now a little further question. What specifically, if anything, do you think would be the thing that you win? Heaven, yeah. So the heavenly afterlife. I mean, you're saying you're right. That's a little minimalist though, Mark. I mean, God's just like, you're right. Done. And that's, you don't get anything else. No, I mean, they say there's a heavenly afterlife, right? So that's heaven. How good is heaven supposed to be? Well, I mean, I don't think you could overemphasize. It's supposed to be considered like infinite bliss, like infinitely happy life, right? Eternal life, fully satisfied. So, I mean, it's positive to infinity. So I'm just going to kind of put the infinity symbol here to designate that that's the biggest win you could possibly win, more than anything else you could ever win. Going to heaven and having eternal life, happy life would be the best possible case. Anyway, though, that's only one of the four boxes. So now in the second box, say a person believes in God, but never mind, there actually wasn't a God. So that's not a win. That's like one of the lost columns or boxes. But what is lost? Let's think about this. A person believes in God, there's no God. If that's the case, then the person didn't win anything, but what is the real loss? Let me see what you think. Box 2, top right. What's the outcome for our person in this case? What do you think is lost, if anything? You didn't really lose anything? Yeah, kind of, Janice. I mean, it's not like you're punished. It's not like something's taken away from you. You just don't get any kind of heavenly afterlife. So there's no gain and there's really no loss. I mean, you could say the loss, if anything at all, is just like the amount of time that a person spends in life practicing religion and, maintaining their religious beliefs. So I don't know, it's not a real big loss, but if it's anything, it's just some time and energy the time and energy spent standing up your religion. But I want to say that that's not a real big loss, and to some it's not even a negative, because you might value the time and energy that you spent in the practice of religion, even if it in the end didn't turn out to be true. So here anyway is one thing to consider. When you believe in God, you have a chance to win the greatest thing possible. Like if you win, you win everything. If you lose, you really don't lose much. You almost lose nothing. But let's look at the other side of the bet. Okay, so say that a person doesn't believe in God. That's their choice, that's their wager. But they're wrong, and God actually did exist. So here we have another loss, right? What is the loss, though? Like, what is the cost to this person if they chose not to believe and they were wrong? Let me hear if you think you could say it in the chat. What could be the loss then? In this box 3, lower left. They don't get to experience heaven. Okay, yes, at a minimum. And some people would even go a stage further and say they could be even, you guys thinking of what I'm thinking of? Like some people say there's hell to worry about. So look, whether it's actually going to hell, which, I mean, how bad is hell? It's like, it's the like opposite extreme, the worst possible thing, forever, torture, gnashing of teeth, fire and brimstone. I mean, the descriptions of hell in the various scriptures are pretty intense. Something that no one would want, right? So endless torture forever and fire and brimstone. Or if you don't believe in the doctrine of hell, because some people don't, at a minimum, if there's God and you didn't believe, then he wouldn't reward you with the reward of heaven. So it's either hell or purgatory, being locked out of heaven. That's the loss of infinitely happy life. So it's kind of like negative to infinity, if that's the outcome. But there's one more case. So say that a person didn't believe in God, and they were correct. There is no God. So, I mean, they were right. We wouldn't call that a loss. I guess it's on the win column side of things. But what is really the win? I mean, what do you get for that? If any, you don't really, I mean, you can't be rewarded in the non-existent afterlife, but I guess if anything, you get back the time and energy that other people in this scenario would have wasted on religion when there's no actual God. So, I mean, some time and energy is what you get to recover in comparison. Okay, so look, in the end, now, well, bragging right's not even, Angel, because you're dead, and when you're dead, you can't brag. And we're not talking about people having a soul, right? If there's no God and no afterlife, so can't brag. But I guess in the objective sense, then you would have been right. Other people might, I mean, no, there's no way to brag about you would never become aware of the non-existence of God. I mean, you're just gone. But anyway, interesting point. So look, here we got this fully filled in little square, and now maybe you can tell me why you think this author Pascal says it's just a way better choice. If you had to make a bet and he thinks you actually do have to wager on this, so you're kind of forced to wager because you can't really decline to take a position. Even declining to take either side is like assigning yourself non-belief. So if you have to take a wager and he thinks you do, why do you believe in his view then, having seen all this? Why is it that it's just a safer bet, a better bet to just believe rather than to not believe? Now I guess we can sort of kind of say it all clearly in conclusion. How would you put it? Why is it better to believe according to this analysis? Let me see. Okay, Kobe, you'd rather believe in God and him not be real than not believe and find out that he is. Yeah, pretty much. It's like when you compare the risks and rewards that are possible on the two sides of the bet, it looks like one is a very dangerous and risky bet because there's not much possible winnings, and it has a huge downside if you lose. So if you lose everything, and if you win, you really don't win anything if you take that bet. On the other hand, if you take this bet, then if you win everything, and if you lose, you really don't lose anything. So one of these bets has a huge potential gain compared against an insignificant loss. And the other available bet holds an immeasurable loss against an insignificant gain. So put yourself in the position of a person asked to take a bet where one of them exposes you to huge potential risks and the other one just insures against loss and doesn't really expose you to any risk. He thinks that if you're rationally risk averse, you don't want to take an unnecessary risk when there's a clearly safer choice, then you would simply choose to believe in God because it will insure you against the possibility of being sent to hell or being denied heaven in case God is real. So he says, why then demand that you can't believe in God unless you had some kind of ironclad proof? Wouldn't it just be better to choose to believe? And if you do, and you're wrong, there's nothing to lose. If you don't believe and you're wrong, you have a lot that you stand to lose. So this is an argument that's trying to not prove that God exists. In fact, it says definitively, this cannot be proven. But do you really want to be wrong if you make a choice not to believe in God? You're putting the condition of your immortal soul, if it does exist, at risk. So that's how the argument goes. Now, let me read a little bit of his words, and you can see what he said about that. So he says, first of all, if there is a God, he's way beyond our comprehension. Since being without limits, he has no relation to us. We're therefore not capable of knowing either what he is or whether he exists. That being so, who would dare to attempt to answer that question? Certainly not we. Who will then condemn Christians for being unable to give rational arguments for their belief, professing as they do a religion for which they cannot give such arguments? Then go on further, and he says, let us examine this point, and let us say either God is or he is not. But to which view shall we be inclined? Reason cannot decide the question. At the far end of this infinite distance, a coin is being spun, which will come down either heads or tails. How will you wager? Reason cannot make you choose either, and reason cannot prove either wrong. So he says, you must wager. There's no choice, and which will you then choose? Since a choice must be made, let us see which offers you the least interest. You have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things to stake, your reason and your will. So he says, let us weigh up the gain and the loss involved in calling heads that God exists. Let us assess the two cases. If you win everything. If you lose nothing. Don't hesitate then. Wager that he does exist. And he says, you would have to play, and it would be unwise of you, once you are obliged to play, not to risk your life in order to win 3 lives at a game in which there is an equal chance of losing and winning. But there is an eternity of life and happiness. That being so, even though there were an infinite number of chances, of which only 1 were in your favor, you would still be right to wager 1 in order to win 2, and you'd be acting wrongly being obliged to play, in refusing to stake 1 life against 3 in a game where out of an infinite number of chances there is 1 in your favor, if there is an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. But here there is an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. That leaves you no choice. Wherever there is infinity and where there are not infinite chances of losing, there's no room for hesitation. You must give everything. And thus, since you are obliged to play, you actually would be renouncing reason if you hoarded your life rather than risking it for an infinite gain, just as likely to occur as a loss that amounts to nothing. Now, I mean, think about it this way. If I came up to you with a coin and I said, hey, here's a coin bet. I want you to choose heads or tails, but here are the parameters of the bet. If you pick heads and you win, I'll give you infinite money. And if you pick heads and you lose, I get to, you have to give me 25 cents. Now, if you pick tails and you win, you get to keep 25 cents. But if you pick tails and you lose, I'll torture you for all time, for eternity. Now, look at that set of bets. In the case where you choose heads, you could win infinite money, and you're only risking a finite amount of money, a quarter. In the other bet, you could win a quarter, but that is held against the risk of infinite loss. So he thinks it would be totally unwise and not even reasonable for a person to take the riskier bet that's holding out not much potential gain, but great potential loss, when the other available bet is just the opposite of that. So that's the Pascal's wager. Notice that it's different in structure because it's not really trying to prove directly that God exists. In fact, it concedes the point that this cannot be proven. But it says even in the absence of certain knowledge and proof, it has to be that he either exists or doesn't. And in case he exists, it is presumed that he would reward the believers and deny such rewards or even extend punishment to the non-believers. So though we can't say definitively that the existence is true, it'd be better to believe as a way of insulating against the risks involved with non-belief. But there's a whole bunch of criticisms available to this argument too. And so I guess when we do return on Tuesday after the weekend, and I'm also going to send out the essay prompts, and we'll talk about those on Tuesday, so just be alert for that. But on Tuesday, we'll speak to the objections against this argument. There's also some interesting objections here. one might argue, how do you really know that God cares whether we believe in him or not? How do you really know whether he rewards believers with heaven and punishes non-believers with hell? If that's not the basis for divine punishment and reward, or if it's on a different basis, then the Pascal wager would not make sense, because it's trying to cause us to have this kind of fear or risk aversion that leads to the choice of believing in God. But that only really makes sense if we think we know how God deals with believers and non-believers in the afterlife. Sergio, it's quite literally a wager instead of an argument. Yeah, it's just a better bet to believe than to not believe. It's kind of stated as a wager, yeah. But I mean, there's a kind of argument that you should take this stance in the wager if you just want to be averse to risk. And he thinks that every rational person promotes their self-interest, right? So how is it in line with your self-interest to take a huge risk that's unnecessary? Yeah, but no, I mean, that's a correct statement. Yeah, Sergio, it's sort of in a gray area between the two. I mean, it's an argument that induces you to take a certain wager, but it's not an argument that seeks to prove the existence of God, because it says that's a bridge too far. That's beyond our powers of argumentation and analysis. Well, very good questions, guys, and great contribution to class. I'm sorry for the little blurriness that we had to deal with today, but the internet outage is something that we can always work around, and in this case, it seems like we did. I fully expect that that's just a one-off thing. I've done hundreds of these lectures literally since COVID started, and it's just very rare that I couldn't get onto the Wi-Fi. But thanks, guys, for soldiering on and helping us through. I guess have a good weekend. I'll be in touch with you through Titanium about those essay prompts. Until Tuesday, though, have a good one. Enjoy the long weekend for President's Day. And yeah, I'll see you then next time, all right? So I'm going to sign off. Feel free to say goodbye or like button, anything you want. Have a good one then, and yeah, take care.